Hi everybody, my name is Paul Abernathy and welcome to another episode of Master the NEC, where we talk about the National Electrical Code. On today's episode, we're continuing our study into the calculations that are involved in the National Electrical Code. And on today's episode, we're going to spend our time focusing on dryer calculations. Now, dryer calculations might seem extremely simple. Okay, you have a table under table 220.54, remembering that all tables that have a number reference also the section that goes along with it, means that we're also dealing with 220.54. It seems pretty simple, pretty cut and dry. Now, if you're dealing with a 12240 volt application, it is pretty simple. It is pretty cut and dry. But what about if your system is being supplied, your feeder or service is being supplied by a three-phase, four-wire application, say a 12208? Then there's something extra you have to do inside of 220.54 that many people don't talk about. And it makes for good information to be on an exam. So if we're preparing for an exam, we want to make sure that we can cover every aspect of that calculation. That's really important. Now remember, before you take any test, whether you're using this as a study material for your own company or for just because you want to learn more about the code, you want to learn calculations, or you're actually preparing for an exam, I'm going to focus on you exam folks for a minute. If you're preparing to take an exam, remember a couple things. One, go to sleep early. Don't spend half the night studying. If you got to the point before the exam that you don't know the information and you have to stay up all night, something's wrong. Okay? You should know the night before whether or not you're ready or not. Get to sleep early. If you want to study during the day, that's fine, but you need a good night's sleep because the mind starts to wander. It starts questioning yourself. And we don't want that when we're preparing for an exam. We want you to be positive. We want you to be upbeat. So stop at 6 o'clock, spend time with the family, relax. You know this. You got this. It's not a problem for you. Calculations, you've been through our series, you've listened to all the videos, you get it. And so you're not going to have any problem with your exam. So stay positive. First thing you do when you wake up in the morning is you want to be ready to nail this thing. You know it. You want to have that cockiness to you that you know that you're going to nail this. You don't want to go into it with any worries. Part of that means that you know how to prepare for the test. It means you've highlighted your code book. You've tabbed it using the proper tabs. You've checked with your local state or whatever the testing association is to make sure what you can and you can't do in your code books. You're all prepared for that. You know that you can't have loose leaves. You know they can't take handbooks in there. You know take a regular code book. You know that in many states you can actually write in it permanently, and you can even make notes in it, whereas some states you can't. You can't use personally made tabs, but you can use professionally made tabs. Just all those type of things. You can't tape things into the book. All these type of things. You need to be prepared for this before you go, so that way you're not shocked by it. So download the test bulletin from whatever the test site is for you to get a better understanding of what's expected of you when you go to the test site. Okay, it's real important. Also, when you get to the test site and you sit down and you're ready to go and you're ready to focus, remember they're going to give you some things up front that you have to take into consideration during the time you're taking your test. For one is they might say that you have to consider all conductors to be copper unless expressed otherwise. Okay, so might be some aluminum in the calculations somewhere, but remember it's always going to be copper unless stated otherwise. Okay. Another thing to remember is that on most calculations, I can't say all, but I'll say most, they're going to tell you up front that you assume the standard calculation. So if you're doing service and feeder calculations, then you're going to do all this based on a standard calculation that's in Part 3 of Article 220. Now, there is a such thing as an optional method, and there's also an optional method for multifamily dwellings in 220.84. And so you just have to know ahead of time when you're taking the test, standard is the standard, okay? Optional is exactly how it sounds, optional. If they say in the question that you can consider the optional method, then you consider the optional method. But if they don't say that, stay with the standard method, okay? Kind of some little things. But again, when you sit down to take your test, they're going to come across the screen and you're going to read it and you're going to use that for the later part of the test. You're going to say, okay, I get it. Assume copper only unless it expressed otherwise. Standard calculations unless they call for an optional calculation. Those type of things, okay? Keep it really simple. All right, so in today's episode, I could just show you how to do 122 40-volt applications, and then like many people do, they leave out that little paragraph in there that talks about 3-phase 4-wire, and I think it's really important that I show you that. Anybody that's ever watched my videos know that I go into a lot more detail than most people do. That's why they tend to go longer, and a lot of people can make it through my entire video, and some people can't make it through my videos. Hey, it doesn't hurt my feelings. You get out of it what you get out of it. If you don't, you don't. Okay, so I'm trying to help you learn. Okay, I want to help you take your game to the next level, and that's what we're all about here. All right, so let's go to the presentation, kind of get started. Remember, we're going to focus on calculations when it comes to when you're doing the overall service or feeder calculations, and we're working on the component that deals with the dryers. Just remember, when you're doing a full calculation for a service or feeder application, you're going to have many components. Small appliance, general lighting, you're going to have your heating and cooling, you're going to have appliances. You're going to have all these things that you're going to piece together. Okay, but one of those are going to be ranges and the other one's going to be dryers. And so you have to understand dryers. If the question about dryers is in your calculation question, then you need to know this. A couple things to remember is, in itself, dryers aren't required by the code. It tells you how to account for them if they are there, but they're not required by the code. So dryers aren't required, but when they are in your exam question or they're in real life, then this is how you do it. Just like ranges. Ranges, I don't know of any dwelling or whatever that doesn't have a range. However, you have to understand that it might have ranges, but it might be a gas range. So you have to take that into account or whatnot. But at the end of the day, ranges or cooking is not a requirement when it comes to adding that value when it comes to the VA or whatever it is for a calculation as part of Article 220. All right, but most of the time it is there, so you know how to do it. Okay, keep that in mind. So we're going to focus on dryers today. All right, so here's the presentation. First one we look at is we're going to look at, this is 220.54. This is actually how it's written in the National Electrical Code. Okay, over here I just did a graphic to kind of show you 24 clothes dryers here all stacked up, replicating a 24 unit multifamily dwelling unit. Okay, so let's read the code. 220.54, electric clothes dryers, dwelling units, plural. Okay, so obviously it applies to a dwelling unit, but it also applies to clearly more than one dwelling unit. All right, so the load for household electric clothes dryers in a dwelling unit or dwelling units shall be either 5,000 watts, which is synonymous with volt amperes. So 5,000 watts is also equivalent to 5,000 volt amperes, or the nameplate rating, whichever is larger. Remember that or means it has to be the difference between this or that, whereas if there was an and in here, A and D, if there was an and in here, then it would have to encompass both this and that. But since it's an or, you're going to look at this one versus this one, and you're going to take the larger of the two. Okay, so in a standard calculation, you're going to have 5,000 watts or the nameplate rating, whichever is larger. And that's what it says right here. Okay, now it goes on to say the use of the demand factors that were allowed in this section is in table 220.54 shall be permitted. Here's another rule that you got to keep in mind. What does shall be permitted means? All right, so let's bring it back to me, and I'll just kind of go over this one as well, because we kind of cover the or, the and, kind of makes you understand that it's either this or that. If it's and, it's this and that. Okay, kind of helps you through the code, understand what those terminologies mean, because or and can play a big role in how you read a question. Okay, key in on that when you look at an exam. Okay, so as we see here, when it was talking about the application of shall be permitted, that's important as well, because it says that you're permitted to use this demand factor table. You're not required to use it. Okay, so if I want to do my calculation and come up with the load to plug into my larger calculation for service and feeder calcs, if I want to take the 5,000 kW and I want to do that and apply it to the 24 dryers, then I can do that. And that ends up with 120,000 VA or 120,000 watts. If I want to plug that into my equation for that service and feeder calculation, go right ahead. But it's going to be a larger service than is necessary, because we do have such thing as diversification. Okay, not all of these dryers are going to be on at the same time. Okay, so you understand that this is permissive, means that I can use this demand factors, and you should use them, because it's going to result in a smaller service, smaller wires, more economical installation. And based on the history of the NEC, it's a proven concept. Okay, so wanted to make sure we're really clear on that. All right, so that's where we're at there. Now, it goes on to say that if you want to use, you can, again, use this table, which is this table right here. It's permitted to do so. All right, the next one is talking about the three-phase application, and I'm going to skip that right now because I have another slide for that that's going to kind of talk about that and dissect that. But if we were just talking a 120 to 40 volt application, then this gets pretty simple. All right, now if it's a single unit, again, if you're doing a test or you're doing for a branch circuit, if it's a single unit, it's either 5,000 watts or the nameplate, whichever is larger. Okay, that's pretty simple. If I'm calculating a dwelling unit, I can use the standard method or the optional method. The biggest difference here is in the standard method, I got to choose the larger of the two we just talked about. Or in the optional method, I use straight from the nameplate rating. Okay, straight from the rating. And it doesn't utilize table 220.54. Okay, you just take the nameplate rating directly from the value. Okay, that's on the piece of equipment. Okay, and then of course we have multifamily dwellings, which is another optional method. Okay, which is covered in another calculation series that we do. But you have this optional method if you have 3 or more dwelling units and you meet some of the caveats. Okay, so we have certain caveats. So you got the standard method in part 3, which is generally you can always use. Then you have optional methods that you can use. But then in a multifamily dwelling, we have another potential optional method that we can use based on 3 or more dwelling units. And of course, there's 3 different caveats that you have to meet. Okay. And if you meet those, then you can use that optional method. Okay. For our class here, we're not going to get into that simply because whatever the optional method that's being used, you're going to use a nameplate value when it comes to dryers. When you're using a standard method, you're going to use the nameplate or the 5,000 watts as a base, and whichever's larger, that's what you're going to plug into your equation, okay? We don't want to make it overly confusing. So let's kind of do this. We have 24 units, and we have 5,000 watt dryers, and it's a 12240, pretty simple. So we have 24 times 5,000 because we stated it was 5,000, okay? Now, don't get confused because if your test question, let me come back to me. If your test question actually said 4,500 is what the dryer was, and you're using the standard method here, then you have the choice of 5,000 or the 4,500. What do you got to do? You got to use the 5,000 because it's the larger of the two. Okay, don't get confused with that. All right, so 24 dryers times 5,000 equals 120,000 watts, or 120 kW, or 120 kVA, or 120,000 volt amperes. Okay, and that makes me bring you back up to this last sentence in 220.54. It reminds you that kilovolt amperes shall be considered equivalent to kilowatts, okay, for load calculations in this specific section, okay? So whatever your overall calculation is doing, we might, in other words, your dryers might be based in watts, but ultimately when you add them to the overall calculation for service and feeders, then you're going to need to convert it into volt amperes. Okay, in order to be able to do that calculation. But really it's saying, look, the watt value that we'll calculate out is equivalent, okay, to what we would get in volt amperes. Okay, that's all it's trying to say there. All right, so let's do it. We've got the 120,000 watts. Now we have to select the demand factor. Pretty simple, right? Now we're going to go to table 220.54 and find that demand factor. All right, here it is. So we go down and we've got 24 units. So we're right here in this column. This is the number of dryers. And this over here is our demand factor. Now, 24 to 42 says that our base demand factor is 35%. That's our base demand factor. Okay. If it was 7 of them and it was a 7-unit building, then it would be 65. Okay. Same principles here. So here, since we've got 24 dryers in this multifamily dwelling, we start at a base of 35. Now the code says that, look, due to diversification, we can start to remove a 0.5% or 0.5% of each dryer that's in excess of 23. Well, in our case, we had 24 dryers, so we exceed 23 by 1. So I'm able to take this 35 and I'm able to take a 0.5% away from that, or a 0.5. And that results in a 34.5%. And that is our new demand factor. Okay, so let's kind of plug it in here. So that's our new value, and that's how we got it. We took the 35 and we took away the 0.5%, which resulted in the fact that we were one dryer over at 24. So that allows us to apply this 0.5%. So we took the 24 minus the 23. That's where we got the 1. So 35% minus 0.5%, or half of 1%, equals 34.5%. And of course, we're going to convert this to decimal. So we move this the decimal point 2 spaces to the left, and that's a conversion, and that tells us it's 0.345. Now, to find out our overall load here, to plug into our service and feeder calculation, depending on what we're doing, it's 120,000 watts times 0.345, or if your calculator allows you, it'd be 120,000 times 34.5%. And that's going to end up in 41.4 or 41,400 watts, or 41,400 volt amperes, or it's going to be 41.4 kW, or it's going to be 41.4 kVA. Okay. So depending on the calculation, depending on what the question asks you, you can see how that's why they stated that the kilowatts and the kVA and all are synonymous. They all work together. As far as this section goes, they all mean the same. Okay? All right, so that's pretty simple. Now, let's get to the question here. This is the one that tends to throw people, and it could be a good question on an exam. What if I'm using single-phase dryers in a 12208 application, and I have this statement here? It says, where 2 or more single-phase dryers are supplied by a 3-phase, let me make sure that my camera's on that, because I want to make sure I don't lose anything. Where 2 or more single-phase dryers are supplied by a 3-phase 4-wire feeder or service, the total load, the total load that we're going to plug into our overall calculation shall be calculated on the basis of twice the maximum number connected between any 2 phases. Okay, so let's kind of round it up to me a little bit. Okay, 24 units. I got 3 phases. Okay, I want to distribute this amongst the 3 phases. Okay, so the code tells us how to do it. The first thing we have to do, let's go back and look, because I'm going to give you an example. We have to determine the maximum number of potential dryers. Oh, incidentally, if anywhere in this video I accidentally say range when I'm talking about dryers, it's been a long day, okay? I did a webinar as well, and then I'm recording this, and bear with me. You know what I'm saying. The good news is they apply the same way. This rule applies the same way whether it's ranges or dryers when it comes to the 3-phase 4-wire applications. Forgive me. All right, so let's go back. There'll always be some hater out there who will want to point that out. I'm sure they're everywhere. I'm sure I'm not immune from it by now. All right, so let's read it. It says, where 2 or more single-phase dryers are supplied by a 3-phase 4-wire feeder or service, the total load shall be calculated on the basis of twice the maximum number connected between any 2 phases. Remember, these are single-phase dryers, but it's still going to have 2 phase conductors and 1 grounded conductor, okay, or neutral conductor, okay? Most opt, there's going to be a grounded conductor in this application. So let's apply it now. Again, if it's a single phase, if it's a single dryer for a single application, and it's a standard method, it's 5,000 watts, nameplate rating, whichever is larger, you take it. But in this application, we're trying to solve for this 3-phase 4-wire condition. So I've got 24 units, and there are 24 5 kW dryers, and we're dealing with a 12208Y system. So I got to find out what the maximum number possible between any 2 of the phases. Okay, an A, B, and C, any 2 of those, I need to find the maximum potential number between any 2. So 24 dryers divided by 3, because it's 3 phases, equals 8. 8 is the maximum number possible between any 2 phases. Now, do that times 2. That equals 16 dryers. So that's the value that we're going to use when we go to the actual table 220.54. And that's how we achieved it. Now, we're not done yet. That's only in order to be able to go find our demand factor. Okay, we had to do something to get that demand factor. All right, now, once we do that, we're going to go to table 220.54 and we're going to find out what is it for 16 dryers. All right, so here we are, 12 to 23, a little different than our previous calculation. So we've got 47% as our base, and it says I get to take away 1% for each dryer exceeding 11. Well, we had 16 based on the results of our calculation because it was a 3-phase 4-wire application. So 16 exceeds 11 by 5. So that tells me that I'm going to be able to take 5% away from this 47% base demand factor. Okay? So what we do is, you see it right here, the 12 to 23 was 47, and you get to take 1 away for each that are over 11. Well, 16 dryers minus 11 equals 5, so that's 5%. So the 47 minus 5% equals 42%. Now we're going to convert this into a decimal. So we move the space from here over 2 to the left, and that's going to give us a conversion to 0.42. Okay, we're going to use that for our decimal for our application, for our calculation. Now, we're not done there. At this point now, remember, we're trying to find out the actual load that you're going to plug into our service and feeder calculation. So first thing we now have to do is we have to find out what is the per phase demand. Okay, so we have 2 phases, and they're the ones that are going to be throughout the system. The dryers are going to be on any 2 given phases, so we're going to have to do that. And then ultimately, we need to then calculate it and find out what our overall load is going to be to formulate our calculation. So let's do this. So first things first, we know we have 16 dryers, and we have to see how we're going to apply our little demand factor here. So we take 16 dryers times 5,000, because that's the rules stated up here. We do it by 5,000. That equals 80,000 watts. Now we get to apply our demand factor. Now our demand factor was 0.42. Okay, so that's going to give us an overall demand. Okay, before we apply anything else. Okay, that's just based on what we have here, based on the overall 16 dryers. So it's 80,000 times 0.42 equals 33,600 watts, or it could be 33.6 kVA, or it could be 33.6 kilowatts. Okay, or it could be 33,600 volt amperes. However you want to do it, depending on the calculation you're working with. Now, you take that and you divide it by 2. Since each dryer will be on 2 phases, that results in 16,800 watts. And that's going to be the value per phase. Now, we're going to plug this into a 3-phase calculation. So what we have to do now is, since at any given time in this system, any given time, we're going to have A, B, and C having dryers connected to it. So now that we take this value and we've been able to work it down and find out what it is the load is per phase, all we do at that point is take the 1 phase and divide it by 3, because it's multiply it by 3. Then we're going to have a total value, and that is the value that we're going to plug into our calculation. So it was similar to the 12240, but we had all these other steps we had to do. Okay, so let's go back and finish it up with that one. Okay, so now we've done that. We take the 16,800 watts, and we do that, multiply it by 3, because we have 3 phases that are being used, A, B, and C, of this 12208Y. That equals 50,400 watts, or 50.4 kW. I guess it also could be called 50.4 kVA. Okay? Or this could be 50,400 volt amperes. Okay? And 50,400 watts. Okay? That is it. Okay? So, pretty simple concept. You kind of work through it. Remember that the calculations for the dryers, and again, if I said range anywhere while I'm talking about dryers, again, it's because this application is similar for ranges, so I get it confused, especially when I'm just rattling off stuff. But when we're talking about the dryer, this is just a small piece that you're going to plug into a much bigger calculation. Okay, just remember, when you're doing optional calculations, you're going to use nameplates when you're dealing with dryers. When you're using a standard calculation, you're going to actually use 5,000 watts or the nameplate, whichever is larger. Okay, it's a pretty simple concept. Now, if you want to know how this little component plugs into the bigger picture, then you need to watch our videos on multifamily dwelling calculations, where I cover 220.84 and some of the nuances in there, or the 3 caveats that you got to meet to even be able to use that. And there's an exception to item number 2 of 220.84, item 2, which says, look, if you have all electric cooking, you're good to go. If you don't have electric cooking, then you have to compare part 3 to this optional method and have an assumed value of 8,000 watts or 8 kW to be used for a invisible fictional range in your optional calculation, and then you compare the two, and whichever results in the lower amount, you can use that. So that's how we apply 220.84. I covered that in a different video. Here we just wanted to focus on dryers. If you remember anything, remember, read the information before you start the exam. Make sure you start with the standard calculation before you go into the optional calculation. Let them tell you to do that, okay? Because it's real important to understand that when you're knowing whether or not you got to use the nameplate or 5,000 watts versus just purely the nameplate. Okay. Well, hopefully you got something out of that lesson. Again, this one was specifically on dryers. We wanted to really show you about the three-phase application and how that breaks out. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to email me at info@masterthenec.com. You can also go to our website and get the contacts link, and you can actually send us an email through the actual website if you wish. Visit us on Twitter at the @MasterTheNEC. Visit us on Facebook. Just go to Facebook and search for Master the NEC. You'll find us. Make it easy. Just go to our website and go to the top of the page, and we have links up there to take you to all our social media. If you're really studying for an exam, then I encourage you to go to our Facebook page. But in our Facebook page, we have what's called a closed group. And in that closed group, you get permission, and I have to approve you. And when you're in there, we go over a lot of calculations, and I supply a lot of information to help you better hone your skills at calculations. And it's just a good group of individuals, and we're over 400 plus members now. So it's really a good group in order to really hone your skills, and people contribute and things like that. So I encourage you to do all that. Again, you're trying to get your game to the next level. You were doing a study. Prepare for the exam. Watch all of our calculation modules, and ultimately you will master the NEC. I promise you. Anyway, till next time, stay safe. God bless.